Hello, my darling, and welcome to today's story time. Chapter 8. The Outlying Pickets of the New World. Our friends at home may well rejoice with us, for we are at our goal. And up to a point at least, we have shown that the statement of Professor Challenger can be verified. We have not, it is true, ascended the plateau, but it lies before us, and even Professor Summerlee is in a more chastened mood. Not that he will for an instant admit that his rival could be right, but he is less persistent in his objections and has sunk for the most part into an observant silence. I must hark back, however, and continue my narrative from where I dropped it. We are sending home one of our local Indians who is injured, and I am committing this letter to his charge with considerable doubts in my mind as to whether it will ever come to hand. When I last wrote, we were about to leave the Indian village where we had been deposited by the Esmeralda. I have to begin my report by bad news. For the first serious personal trouble, I pass over the incessant bickerings between the professors, occurred this evening and might have had a tragic ending. I have spoken of our English-speaking friend, Gomez, a fine worker and a willing fellow, but afflicted, I fancy, with the vice of curiosity, which is common enough among such men. On the last evening, he seems to have hid himself near the hut in which we were discussing our plans, and there he was observed by Zambo, who is as faithful as a dog and has the hatred which all his race bear to the others. He was dragged out and carried into our presence. Gomez whipped out his knife, however, and, but for the huge strength of his captor, which enabled him to disarm him with one hand, he would certainly have stabbed him. The matter has ended in reprimands. The opponents have been compelled to shake hands, and there is every hope that all will be well. As to the feuds of the two learned men, they are continuous and bitter. It must be admitted that Challenger is provocative in the last degree, but Summerlee has an acid tongue, which makes matters worse. Last night, Challenger said that he had never cared to walk on the Thames embankment and look up at the river, as it was always sad to see one's own eventual goal. He is convinced, of course, that he is destined for Westminster Abbey. Summerlee rejoined, however, with a sour smile, and said that he understood that Millbank Prison had been pulled down. Challenger's conceit is too colossal to allow him to be really annoyed. He only smiled in his beard and repeated, "Really, really," in the pitying tone one would use for a child. Indeed, they are children both, the one wizened and cantankerous, the other formidable and overbearing, yet each with a brain which has put him on the front rank of his scientific age. Brain, character, soul. Only as one sees more of life does one understand how distinct each is. The very next day, we did actually make our start upon this remarkable expedition. We found that all of our possessions fit very easily into the two canoes, and we divided our personnel, 6 in each, taking the obvious precaution in the interests of peace of putting one professor in each canoe. Personally, I was with Challenger, who was in a beatific humor, moving about as one in a silent ecstasy and beaming benevolence from every feature. I have had some experience of him in other moods, however, and shall be the less surprised when the thunderstorms suddenly come up amidst the sunshine if it is impossible to be at your ease, it is equally impossible to be dull in his company, for one is always in a state of half tremulous doubt as to what sudden turn his formidable temper may take. For 2 days we made our way up a good-sized river, some hundreds of yards broad and dark in color, but transparent, so that one could usually see the bottom. The affluents of the Amazon are, half of them, of this nature, while the other half are whitish and opaque, the difference depending on the class of country through which they have flowed. The dark indicate vegetable decay, while the others point to a clay-like soil. Twice we came across rapids, and in each case made a portage of half a mile or so to avoid them. The woods on either side were primeval, which are more easily penetrated than woods of the second growth, and we had no great difficulty in carrying our canoes through them. How shall I ever forget the solemn mystery of it? The height of the trees and the thickness of the boles exceeding anything which I in my town-bred life could have imagined, shooting upwards in magnificent columns until, at an enormous distance above our heads, we could dimly discern the spot where they threw out their side branches into Gothic upward curves, which coalesced to form one great matted roof of verdure, through which only an occasional golden ray of sunshine shot downwards to trace a thin, dazzling line of light amidst the majestic obscurity. As we walked noiselessly amid the thick, soft carpet of decaying vegetation, the hush fell upon our souls, which comes upon us in the twilight of the abbey, and even Professor Challenger's full-chested notes sank into a whisper. Alone, I should have been ignorant of the names of these giant growths, but our men of science pointed out the cedars, the great silk cotton trees, and the redwood trees, with all the profusion of various plants which has made this continent the chief supplier to the human race of those gifts of nature which depend upon the vegetable world, while it is the most backward in those products which come from animal life. Vivid orchids and wonderful colored lichens smoldered upon the swarthy tree trunks, and where a wandering shaft of light fell full upon the golden almondata, the scarlet star clusters of the taxonia, or the rich deep blue ipomea. The effect was of a dream, like fairyland, in these great wastes of forest. Life, which abhors the darkness, struggles ever upwards to the light. Every plant, even the smaller ones, curl and writhe to the green surface, twining itself round its stronger and taller brethren in the effort. Climbing plants are monstrous and luxuriant, but others which have never been known to climb elsewhere learn the art as an escape from that somber shadow, so that the common nettle, the jasmine, and assorted palm trees can be seen circling the stems of the cedars and striving to reach their crowns. Of animal life there was no movement amid the majestic vaulted aisles which stretched from us as we walked, but a constant movement far above our heads told of the multitudinous world of snake and monkey, bird and sloth, which lived in the sunshine. They were looking down in wonder at our tiny, dark, stumbling figures in the obscure depths immeasurably below them. At dawn and at sunset, the howler monkeys screamed together, and the parakeets broke into a shrill chatter. But during the hot hours of the day, only the full drone of insects, like the beat of a distant surf, filled the ear, while nothing else moved amid the solemn vistas of stupendous trunks, fading away into the darkness which held us in. Once some bandy-legged, lurking creature, maybe an ant-eater or a bear, scuttled clumsily amid the shadows. It was the only sign of earth life which I saw in this great Amazonian forest. And yet there were indications that even human life itself was not far from us in these mysterious recesses. On the third day out, we were aware of a singular, deep throbbing in the air, rhythmic, solemn, coming and going fitfully throughout the morning. The two boats were paddling within a few yards of each other when first we heard it, and our Indians remained motionless, as if they had been turned to bronze, listening intently, expressions of terror upon their faces. "What is it, then?" I asked. "Drums," said Lord John, carelessly. "War drums. I have heard them before." "Yes, sir, war drums," said Gomez. "Wild Indians, bravos, not mansos. They watch us every mile of the way, and will kill us if they can." "How can they watch us?" I asked, gazing into the dark, motionless void. Gomez shrugged his broad shoulders. "The Indians know. They have their own way. They watch us. They talk the drum talk to each other. They'll kill us if they can." By the afternoon of that day, my pocket diary shows me it was Tuesday, August 18th. At least 6 or 7 drums were throbbing from various points. Sometimes they beat quickly, sometimes slowly, sometimes in obvious question and answer, far to the east, breaking out in a high, staccato rattle, and then being followed after a pause by a deep roll from the north. There was something indescribably nerve-wracking and menacing in that constant mutter. No one ever moved or talked in the silent woods. All the peace and soothing of quiet nature lay in that dark curtain of vegetation. But away from behind there came one message from our fellow man. "We will kill you if we can," said the men in the east. "We will kill you if we can," said the men in the north. All day the drums rumbled and whispered, while their menace reflected itself in the faces of our companions. Even the hardy, swaggering man seemed cowed. I learned, however, that day, once for all, that both Summerlee and Challenger possessed that highest type of bravery, the bravery of the scientific mind. Theirs was the spirit which upheld Darwin among the gauchos of the Argentine, or Wallace among the headhunters of Malaya. It is decreed by a merciful nature that the human brain cannot think of two things simultaneously, so that if it be steeped in curiosity as to science, it has no room for merely personal considerations. All day amid that incessant and mysterious menace, our two professors watched every bird upon the wing and every shrub upon the bank, with many a sharp, wordy contention. When the snarl of Summerlee came quick upon the deep growl of Challenger, but with no more sense of danger and no more reference to drum-beating Indians than if they were seated together in the smoking room of the Royal Society's Club in St. James's Street. Only once did they condescend to discuss them. "Maranya or Amajauca cannibals," said Challenger, jerking his thumb towards the reverberating wood. "No doubt, sir," Summerlee answered. "Like all such tribes, I shall expect to find them of polysynthetic speech, perhaps Mongolian." "Polysynthetic, certainly," said Challenger. "I am not aware that any other type of language exists in this continent, and I have notes of more than 100. The Mongolian theory I regard with deep suspicion. I should have thought that even a limited knowledge of comparative anatomy would have helped to verify that, said Summerlee bitterly. Challenger thrust out his aggressive chin until he was all beard and hat rim. No doubt, sir, a limited knowledge would have that effect. When one's knowledge is exhaustive, one comes to other conclusions. They glared at each other in mutual defiance, while all round rose the distant whisper, "We will kill you. We will kill you if we can." That night, we moored our canoes with heavy stones for anchors in the center of the stream and made every preparation for possible attack. Nothing came, however, and with the dawn we pushed upon our way, the drum beating dying out behind us. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we came to a very steep rapid, more than a mile long, the very one in which Professor Challenger had suffered disaster on his first journey. I confess that the sight of it consoled me, for it was really the first direct corroboration, slight as it was, of the truth of his story. The Indians carried first our canoes, and then our stores through the brushwood, which is very thick at this point, and we four, with rifles on our shoulders, walked between them and any danger coming from the woods. Before evening, we had successfully passed the rapids and made our way some 10 miles above them, where we anchored for the night. At this point, I reckoned that we had come not less than 100 miles up the tributary from the main stream. It was in the early forenoon of the next day that we made the great departure. Since dawn, Professor Challenger had been acutely uneasy, continually scanning each bank of the river. Suddenly, he gave an exclamation of satisfaction and pointed to a single tree. "What do you make of that?" he asked. It jutted at a peculiar angle over the side of the stream. "It is surely an acai palm," said Summerlee. "Exactly," said Challenger. "It was an acai palm which I took for my landmark. The secret opening is half a mile onwards upon the other side of the river. There is no break in the trees. That is the wonder and mystery of it. There where you see the light green rushes instead of dark green undergrowth, there between the great cottonwoods, that is my private gate into the unknown. Push through and you will understand." It was indeed a wonderful place. Having reached the spot marked by a line of light green rushes, we pulled out 2 canoes through them for some hundreds of yards and eventually emerged into a placid and shallow stream, running clear and transparent over a sandy bottom. It may have been 20 yards across and was banked in on each side by most luxuriant vegetation. Inside was a hidden fairyland, the most wonderful that the imagination of man could conceive. The thick vegetation met overhead, interlacing into a natural pergola, and through this tunnel of verdure in a golden twilight flowed the green, pellucid river, beautiful in itself, but marvelous from the strange tints thrown by the vivid lights from above, filtered and tempered in its fall. Clear as crystal, motionless as a sheet of glass, green as the edge of an iceberg, it stretched in front of us under its leafy archway, every stroke of our paddles sending 1,000 ripples across its shining surface. It was a fitting avenue to a land of wonders. All sign of the Indians had passed away, but animal life was more frequent, and the tameness of the creatures showed that they knew nothing of the hunter. Fuzzy black velvet monkeys with snow-white teeth and gleaming, mocking eyes chattered at us as we passed. With a dull, heavy splash, an occasional caiman plunged in from the bank. Once, a dark, clumsy tapir stared at us from a gap in the bushes, and then lumbered away through the forest. Once, too, the yellow, sinuous form of a great puma whisked amid the brushwood, and its green, baleful eyes glared hatred at us over its tawny shoulder. Bird life was abundant, especially the wading birds, stork, heron, and ibis, gathering in small groups, blue, scarlet, and white, on every log jutting from the bank, while beneath us the crystal water was alive with fish of every shape and color. For 3 days we made our way up this tunnel of hazy green sunshine. On the longer stretches, one could hardly tell as one looked ahead where the distant green water ended and the distant green archway began. The deep peace of this strange waterway was unbroken by any sign of man. On the 3rd day, it became evident that our journey in the canoes could not last much longer. The stream was rapidly growing too shallow. Twice in as many hours we stuck upon the bottom. Finally, we pulled the boats up among the brushwood and spent the night on the bank of the river. In the morning, Lord John and I made our way for a couple of miles through the forest, keeping parallel with the stream. But as it grew ever shallower, we returned and reported what Challenger had already suspected, that we had reached the highest point to which the canoes could be brought. We drew them up, therefore, and concealed them among the bushes, blazing a tree with our axes so we could find them again. Then we distributed the various burdens among us: guns, ammunition, food, a tent, blankets, and the rest. And, shouldering our packages, we set forth upon the more laborious stage of our journey. An unfortunate quarrel between our pepper pots marked the outset of our new stage. Challenger had from the moment of joining us issued directions to the whole party, much to the evident discontent of Summerlee. Now, upon his assigning some duty to his fellow professor, it was only the carrying of a barometer, the matter suddenly came to a head. "May I ask, sir," said Summerlee, with vicious calm, "in what capacity you take it upon yourself to issue these orders?" Challenger glared and bristled. "I do it, Professor Summerlee, as a leader of this expedition." "I am compelled to tell you, sir, I do not recognize you in that capacity," said Summerlee. "Indeed?" Challenger bowed with unwieldy sarcasm. "Perhaps you would define my exact position." "Yes, sir," said Summerlee. "You are a man whose veracity is upon trial, and this committee is here to try it. You walk, sir, with your judges." "Dear me," said Challenger, seating himself on the other side of the canoes. "In that case, you will, of course, go on your own way, and I will follow at my leisure. If I am not the leader, you cannot expect me to lead." Thank heaven there were 2 sane men, Lord John Roxton and myself, to prevent the petulance and folly of our learned professors from sending us back empty-handed to London. Such arguing and pleading and explaining before we could get them mollified. Then at last Summerlee, with his sneer and his pipe, would move forwards, and Challenger would come rolling and grumbling after. By some good fortune, we discovered about this time that both professors had the very poorest opinion of Dr. Illingworth of Edinburgh. Thenceforward, that one was our safety, and every strained situation was relieved by our introducing the name of the Scotch zoologist, when both our professors would form a temporary alliance and friendship in their detestation and abuse of this common rival. Advancing in single file along the bank of the stream, we soon found that it narrowed to a mere brook, and finally that it lost itself in a great green morass of sponge-like mosses, into which we sank up upon our knees. The place was horribly haunted by clouds of mosquitoes and every form of flying pest. So we were glad to find solid ground again and make a circuit among the trees. This enabled us to outflank the pestilent morass, which droned like an organ in the distance, so loud was it with insect life. On the second day after leaving our canoes, we found that the whole character of the country changed. Our road was persistently upwards, and as we ascended the woods became thinner and lost their tropical luxuriance. The huge trees of the alluvial Amazonian plain gave place to the phoenix and cocoa palms, growing in scattered clumps, with thick brushwood between. In the damper hollows, the maruschia palms grew out their graceful, drooping fronds. We traveled entirely by compass, and once or twice there were differences of opinion between Challenger and the two Indians, when, to quote the professor's indignant words, the whole party agreed to trust the fallacious instincts of an undeveloped tribe rather than the highest product of modern European culture. That we were justified in doing so was shown upon the third day, when Challenger admitted that he recognized several landmarks of his former journey, and in one spot we actually came upon 4 fire-blackened stones, which must have marked a camping place. The road still ascended, and we crossed a rock-studded slope, which took 2 days to traverse. The vegetation had again changed, and only the vegetable ivory tree remained, with a great profusion of wonderful orchids, among which I learned to recognize the rare Newtonia and the glorious pink and scarlet blossoms of Catalia. Occasional brooks with pebbly bottoms and fern-draped banks gurgled down the shallow gorges in the hill and offered good camping grounds every evening on the banks of some rock-studded pool. There, swarms of little blue-backed fish, about the size and shape of English trout, gave us a delicious supper. On the 9th day after leaving the canoes, having done, as I reckon, about 120 miles, we began to emerge from the trees, which had grown smaller until they were mere shrubs. Their place was taken by an immense wilderness of bamboo, which grew so thickly that we could only penetrate it by cutting a pathway with the machetes and billhooks of the Indians. It took us a long day, traveling from 7 in the morning until 8 at night, with only 2 breaks of 1 hour each to get through this obstacle. Anything more monotonous and wearying could not be imagined, for even at the most open places, I could not see more than 10, maybe 12 yards. Usually, my vision was limited to the back of Lord John's cotton jacket in front of me, and to the yellow wall within a foot of me on either side. From above came one thin knife edge of sunshine, and 15 feet over our heads, one saw the tops of the reeds swaying against the deep blue sky. I do not know what kind of creatures inhabit such a thicket, but several times we heard the plunging of large, heavy animals quite close to us. From their sounds, Lord John judged them to be some form of wild cattle. Just as night fell, we cleared the belt of bamboos and at once formed our camp, exhausted by the interminable day. Early next morning we were again afoot, and found that the character of the country had changed once again. Behind us was the wall of bamboo, as definite as if it marked the course of a river. In front was an open plain, sloping slightly upwards and dotted with clumps of tree ferns, the whole curving before us until it reached a long, Whaleback Ridge. This we reached about midday, only to find a shallow valley beyond, rising once again into a gentle incline, which led to a low, rounded skyline. It was here, while we crossed the first of these hills, that an incident occurred which may or may not have been important. Professor Challenger, who with the two local Indians was in the van of the party, stopped suddenly and pointed excitedly to the right. As he did so, we saw, at the distance of a mile or so, something which appeared to be a huge grave bird flap slowly up from the ground and skim smoothly off, flying very low and straight until it was lost among the tree ferns. "Did you see it?" cried Challenger in exultation. "Summerlee, did you see it?" His colleague was staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared. "What do you claim that it was?" he asked. "To the best of my belief, a pterodactyl." Summerlee burst into derisive laughter. "A fiddlestick," he said. "It was a stork if I ever saw one." Challenger was too furious to speak. He simply swung his pack upon his back and continued his march. Lord John came abreast of me, however, and his face was more grave than was his wont. He had his Zeiss glasses in his hand. "I focused it before it got over the trees," said he. "I won't undertake to say what it was, but I'll risk my reputation as a sportsman that it wasn't any bird that ever I clapped eyes on in all of my life." So there the matter stands. Are we really just on the edge of the unknown, encountering the outlying pickets of this lost world of which our leader speaks? I give you the incident as it occurred, and you will know as much as I do. It stands alone, for we saw nothing more which could be called remarkable. And now, my readers, if I have any, I have brought you up the broad river and through the screen of rushes and down the green tunnel and up the long slope of palm trees, through the bamboo brake and across the plain of tree ferns. At last our destination lay in full sight of us. When we had crossed the second ridge, we saw before us an irregular, palm-studded plain, and then the line of high red cliffs which I have seen in the picture. And there it lies, even as I write, and there can be no question that it is the same. At the nearest point, it is about 7 miles from our present camp, and it curves away, stretching as far as I can see. Challenger struts about like a prize peacock, and Summerlee is silent, but still skeptical. Another day should bring some of our doubts to an end. Meanwhile, as Jose, whose arm was pierced by a broken bamboo, insists upon returning, I send this letter back in his charge, and I only hope that it may eventually come to hand. I will write again as the occasion serves. I have enclosed with this a rough chart of our journey, which may have the effect of making the account rather easier to understand. And this, my darling, ends our story time for today. As always, I hope that you have very sweet and creepy dreams.